The wedding dress dragged behind her like a ghost through the snow, its once pristine satin now stained with mud and tears. Clara Thompson's bare feet had long since gone numb, but she kept walking down the empty mountain road, each step taking her further from the church where she'd been left standing at the altar just hours before. The Wyoming winter was merciless, and the storm that had been threatening all morning finally unleashed its fury. Through the swirling white, she could barely make out the silhouette of a lone rider watching her from the ridge above. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara had never imagined her wedding day would begin with her father's worried voice echoing through the farmhouse at dawn. "Storm's coming in fast," he'd called from downstairs. "Might want to move the ceremony up a few hours." But Victoria Thompson had spent 2 years planning every detail of her daughter's wedding, and she wasn't about to let a little mountain weather ruin her vision. The ceremony would proceed at 3 o'clock sharp, just as they'd planned. The church in Silverbrook had been decorated with white roses imported from Denver, and the reception hall at the Grand Mountain Hotel was prepared to host 200 guests. Clara stood before her bedroom mirror, watching her mother fuss with the intricate beadwork on her dress. The gown belonged to her grandmother, a delicate creation of ivory satin and French lace that had been carefully preserved for 60 years. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "You look absolutely radiant, sweetheart," Victoria whispered, adjusting the pearl necklace that had also been passed down through generations. "Robert is going to be speechless when he sees you." Robert Hawkins came from one of the most prominent ranching families in the county. His father owned the largest cattle operation in 3 states, and the marriage would unite 2 of the most influential families in the region. It was a practical match, one that made sense for everyone involved. Clara had known Robert since childhood, and while she wouldn't describe their relationship as passionate, it was comfortable and secure. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Clara's sister Madison arrived from Colorado Springs with her 3 children, bringing chaos and laughter to the usually quiet Thompson household. The photographer captured every moment, Clara having her hair styled in an elegant updo, the bridesmaids in their deep burgundy dresses. The groomsmen gathered in the parlor sharing stories and cigars. By noon, the snow had begun falling in earnest. Large, heavy flakes drifted past the windows, coating the pine trees and fence posts in pristine white. Clara watched from her bedroom window as guests began arriving at the church across town, their dark figures moving carefully through the accumulating snow. "It's beautiful," she murmured, though something in her chest felt tight with anxiety. Her mother appeared beside her, following her gaze. "A winter wedding is so romantic. And look how the snow makes everything look like a fairy tale." At 2 o'clock, the bridal party gathered for photographs in the Thompsons' formal living room. Clara posed with her bouquet of white orchids and baby's breath, her smile bright and practiced. She'd been preparing for this day her entire life, not just the wedding, but the life that would follow. She would be Mrs. Robert Hawkins, mistress of a grand ranch house, mother to future heirs of the Hawkins legacy. The photographer, a cheerful woman from Jackson, took dozens of shots. Clara with her parents, with her sister, with the bridesmaids, who had been her closest friends since childhood. Everyone laughed and chattered, but Clara found herself growing quieter as the time approached. At 2:30, they loaded into the decorated cars for the short drive to Silverbrook Methodist Church. The snow was falling more heavily now, and Clara could feel the temperature dropping even inside the heated vehicle. Her father sat beside her, unusually silent as he watched the white landscape pass by the windows. Having second thoughts? He asked quietly, his weathered hand covering hers. Clara looked at him in surprise. James Thompson had always been a man. A few words, more comfortable with horses and cattle than emotions. "What do you mean?" "I've been watching you all morning," he said. "You've got that same look you had when you were 7, and I made you ride that ornery old mare. Scared, but trying to convince yourself you wanted to do it anyway." The comparison stung because it felt uncomfortably accurate. "I'm just nervous, Dad. Every bride gets nervous." He squeezed her hand gently. "There's a difference between nervous and afraid, sweetheart. And there's no shame in changing your mind if something doesn't feel right." Before Clara could respond, they arrived at the church. The Gothic stone building looked magnificent against the snowy backdrop, its stained glass windows glowing warmly. In the gray afternoon light, cars filled the small parking lot, and Clara could see guests hurrying through the snow toward the entrance. Inside, the sanctuary was exactly as Victoria had envisioned. White roses and greenery adorned every pew, and hundreds of candles cast a golden glow throughout the space. The organist was already playing soft preludes as guests took their seats, their voices creating a gentle murmur of conversation. Clara was whisked to the bride's room, a small chamber behind the altar where she would wait for her cue. Through the thin walls, she could hear the church filling with people. Friends from school, business associates of both families, relatives who had traveled from across the mountain states. Everyone who mattered in their social circle was here. To witness the union of Clara Thompson and Robert Hawkins, Madison helped her adjust her veil one final time, the delicate lace falling in perfect folds around Clara's shoulders. "You're going to be the most beautiful bride this town has ever seen," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." At exactly 3 o'clock, the organist began the processional. Clara's bridesmaids lined up in order, each carrying a bouquet of burgundy roses that complemented their dresses perfectly. The church doors opened, and one by one, they made their way down the aisle. Clara stood with her father at the back of the sanctuary, her arm linked through his, through her veil. She could see the congregation rising to their feet, all eyes turned toward her. The scene was exactly what she had dreamed of. As a little girl, the fairy tale wedding that every young woman was supposed to want. But as she looked toward the altar, her heart began to race for all the wrong reasons. The space where Robert should be standing was empty. Reverend Mitchell stood alone, his kind face creased with concern. The best man, Robert's brother David, was whispering urgently to someone in the front row. Clara felt her father's arm tense beside her. "Where is he?" she whispered. The murmur of the congregation grew louder as people began to notice what Clara had already seen. Mrs. Hawkins was standing in the front row, her face pale with embarrassment. She caught Clara's eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. David Hawkins approached them, his face grim. "Clara, I'm so sorry," he said in a low voice. "Robert... He's not here. He left town this morning." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "Left town? What do you mean, left town?" "He drove to Denver before dawn," David explained, his voice barely audible over the growing buzz of conversation from the congregation. "He left a letter with my mother. He said he couldn't go through with it. He's sorry, but he realized he's not ready for marriage." Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Around her, the perfect wedding was dissolving into chaos. Guests were standing and talking among themselves, pointing and staring. The photographer was still taking pictures, capturing what was supposed to be the most beautiful moment of Clara's life as it transformed into a public humiliation. "I need to get out of here," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. Her father immediately understood. Without another word, he began guiding her toward a side door that led directly outside. Avoiding the main aisle where 200 guests waited for explanations she couldn't give. Madison and the bridesmaids followed, their faces shocked and confused. The cold air hit Clara like a slap as they emerged from the church. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that immediately began settling on her dress and veil. She could hear the chaos inside growing louder as news of Robert's absence spread through the congregation. "We need to get you home," her father sighed, his arm protective around her shoulders. But Clara pulled away from him, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just happened. Everyone in Silverbrook would know by evening that she had been abandoned at the altar. The story would spread through the county like wildfire. Poor Clara Thompson, left standing in her grandmother's wedding dress while her groom fled to Denver rather than marry her. "Clara, honey, please." Victoria appeared beside them, her face streaked with tears. "Let's go home and figure this out." But Clara couldn't bear the thought of facing their house full of wedding preparations, the reception hall where dinner was waiting to be served, the gifts that would need to be returned. She couldn't face the phone calls and sympathy visits that would follow, the pitying looks and whispered conversations. Without a word, she gathered up the heavy skirts of her wedding dress and began walking. Not toward the cars where her family waited, but away from the church, away from the town, away from the life that had just crumbled around her. "Clara, wait!" Her father called after her, but she didn't stop. She walked through the church parking lot and onto the main road that led out of Silverbrook, her satin shoes slipping on the snow-covered pavement. Behind her, she could hear her family calling her name, but their voices grew fainter with each step. The storm was intensifying, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Clara's hands were already numb, and she could feel the cold seeping through her thin dress. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had been so certain of her path, so confident in the life she was building. Robert had been part of her future for so long that she had never questioned whether he truly wanted to be there. Now she realized she had been blind to the signs, his increasing distance over the past few months, his reluctance to discuss honeymoon plans, the way he had seemed more interested in the business aspects of their union than the romantic ones. As she walked, Clara began pulling pins from her elaborately styled hair, letting the dark strands fall loose around her shoulders. The veil, which had seemed so beautiful just an hour ago, now felt like a mockery. She untied it and let it fall to the ground, where it immediately became soaked and dirty in the snow. The road stretched ahead of her, winding through pine forests and open meadows toward the higher elevations of the mountain range. Clara had no destination in mind. She simply needed to move, to put distance between herself and the disaster her life had become. The snow crunched under her feet, and her breath came out in white puffs in the cold air. Her wedding dress, with its long train and delicate fabric, was completely unsuitable for walking through a snowstorm, but Clara didn't care. Nothing about this day was going according to plan anyway. As she climbed higher into the mountains, the wind picked up, sending snow swirling around her in dizzying patterns. The road became less distinct, and Clara realized she could no longer see the lights of Silverbrook behind her. She was completely alone in the wilderness, wearing nothing but a wedding dress in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard. For the first time since leaving the church, Clara felt a flutter of real fear. She had been so focused on escaping her humiliation that she hadn't considered the practical dangers of her situation. The temperature was well below freezing, and she was miles from any shelter. But even as the rational part of her mind recognized the foolishness of her actions, she couldn't bring herself to turn back. The thought of returning to town, of facing all those people who had witnessed her abandonment, was more terrifying than the storm. She continued walking, her feet now completely numb in her ruined satin shoes. The beadwork on her dress caught and snagged on branches as she passed through areas where the forest encroached on the road. Each step was becoming more difficult as the snow deepened and her dress grew heavier with accumulated moisture. Light was fading rapidly, and Clara realized that in her emotional state, she had been walking for much longer than she'd thought. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and she could no longer feel her hands or feet. Her lips were probably blue, and she was beginning to shiver uncontrollably. It was then that she saw him, through the swirling snow. A lone figure on horseback materialized on the ridge above the road. Clara stopped walking and stared up at the silhouette, wondering if exhaustion and cold were making her hallucinate. But the rider was real, sitting motionless on his horse, as if he had been watching her approach. Even at a distance, she could tell he was dressed like a working cowboy. Heavy coat, wide-brimmed hat, and boots designed for long days in the saddle. The horse stood perfectly still despite the wind and snow, trained to respond to its rider's slightest command. Clara raised her hand, unsure whether to wave for help or simply acknowledge his presence. The gesture felt strange and formal given her desperate circumstances, but she had been raised to observe proper etiquette even in the most unusual situations. The rider observed her for a long moment, taking in her wedding dress, her bare head, her obvious distress. Then, without any apparent signal from his rider, the horse began picking its way down the slope toward the road. The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, his boots landing silently in the deep snow. Clara watched him approach, noting how he moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to working in harsh conditions. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but she could see weathered features and eyes the color of storm clouds. He stopped several feet away, respecting her space while assessing her condition with the practiced eye of someone who knew the mountains. His gaze took in her soaked wedding dress, her blue-tinged lips, the way she swayed slightly on her feet from exhaustion and cold. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Even that single word carried the distinctive drawl of someone born and raised in ranch country. Clara tried to respond, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form coherent words. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the gesture provided little warmth through the thin satin of her dress. Without another word, the cowboy shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat. It was clearly well used, with patches on the elbows and faded areas where leather chaps had rubbed against it over countless hours in the saddle. He held it out to her. Clara stared at the offered coat, her mind struggling to process this unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. In her world, interactions with unfamiliar men followed strict social protocols. There would be introductions, polite conversation, proper chaperonage. This silent cowboy was operating by entirely different rules. "I can't," she managed to whisper through chattering teeth. "I don't even know your name." He tilted his head slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Name's Jake," he said quietly. "Jake Morrison, and you're freezing to death." The practical observation cut through Clara's social conditioning. She accepted the coat with trembling hands, grateful for its immediate warmth and the scent of leather and pine that clung to the fabric. It was far too large for her frame, but it blocked the wind and retained the heat from Jake's body. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now that the shivering had subsided slightly. Jake nodded once, then looked back at his horse. The animal was a sturdy quarter horse, built for endurance rather than speed, with the calm temperament necessary for ranch work. The saddle was well maintained but functional, without any of the decorative touches that city riders favored. "The storm's getting worse," Jake observed, squinting up at the darkening sky. "The road back to town will be impassable soon." Clara followed his gaze, realizing for the first time how completely she had miscalculated her situation. The snow was falling so heavily now that she could barely see 50 yards in any direction. The temperature had dropped dramatically since she left the church, and the wind was picking up strength. "I have a cabin about 2 miles up the mountain," Jake continued. "You can warm up there, wait for the storm to pass." The offer should have alarmed her. Everything about proper society dictated that a young woman should never accept such an invitation from a strange man, particularly one who lived alone in the wilderness. But Clara's near hypothermic state made conventional concerns seem irrelevant. "I should get back to town," she said weakly, though even as she spoke the words, she knew it was impossible. Jake's eyes swept the road behind her, already obscured by blowing snow. "Town's 8 miles, he said simply. "You wouldn't make it. Half a mile in this weather." The truth of his assessment was undeniable. Clara had been walking for hours, and her strength was nearly depleted. Her feet were so numb she could no longer feel them, and despite Jake's coat, she was still shivering uncontrollably. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, genuinely curious about this stranger's motivations. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on adjusting his horse's bridle. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear him over the wind. "Lost someone to these mountains once," he said. "I couldn't live with myself if I let it happen again." There was a weight to his words that suggested a deep personal tragedy, but Clara sensed this wasn't a man who shared his story easily. She didn't press for details. Instead, she looked at his horse, a practical question occurring to her. "But if I take your horse, how will you get to your cabin?" Jake's response surprised her. He began unbuckling his saddle with quick, efficient movements. "Horse carries both of us, or neither of us. That's how it works up here." Clara watched him work, noting the care with which he handled his equipment. Every piece of leather was well-oiled and properly maintained, speaking to years of experience in conditions that would destroy inferior gear. This was clearly a man who understood that in the mountains, your equipment could mean the difference between life and death. He lifted the saddle from the horse's back and set it carefully in the snow, then removed the bridle as well. The horse stood perfectly still throughout the process, trained to ground tie without restraint. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, confused by his actions. "Making it easier for both of us," Jake explained, pulling a simple halter and lead rope from his saddlebags. "Bareback's more comfortable for 2 riders, and Lucy here is steady enough to carry us both." Clara stared at him in alarm. "I can't ride bareback. I've barely ridden at all, and never without a saddle." Jake paused in his preparations, studying her face in the dim light. "You ever been on a horse before?" "A few times," Clara admitted, "but always side saddle with an instructor in a controlled environment." The contrast between her experience and what Jake was proposing couldn't have been greater. The few times she had ridden, it had been on gentle, well-trained horses in a fenced arena, wearing proper riding attire and accompanied by a professional instructor. The idea of riding bareback through a mountain blizzard on an unfamiliar horse was terrifying, but Jake seemed to understand her fear. He approached the horse slowly, running his hands along its neck and speaking in soft, reassuring tones. "Lucy's been carrying folks for 15 years, he said. "She's got more sense than most people I know. All you have to do is hold on." He positioned himself beside the horse, then looked back at Clara. "I'll ride behind you, keep you steady. You won't fall." There was something in his quiet confidence that made Clara believe him. This man clearly knew horses and mountains better than anyone she had ever met. If he said it was safe, she had to trust his judgment. Jake helped her approach the horse, guiding her hand to Lucy's neck so she could feel the animal's calm breathing. The mare stood perfectly still, accustomed to carrying nervous riders. "She likes you," Jake observed, noting how Lucy lowered her head slightly at Clara's touch. "How can you tell?" Ears forward, muscles relaxed. "She's curious about you, not worried." With Jake's assistance, Clara managed to climb onto Lucy's back, though the process was made difficult by her waterlogged wedding dress. The heavy fabric tangled around her legs, and she had to bunch it up awkwardly to maintain any semblance of modesty. Jake mounted behind her with the effortless motion of someone who had been riding since childhood. Clara tensed as she felt his presence behind her, acutely aware that this was the closest she had ever been to any man other than Robert. "Relax," Jake said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "If you're tense, she'd be tense too." He reached around her to take the lead rope, and Clara caught another whiff of his scent: leather, wood smoke, and something clean and outdoorsy. That was completely different from the cologne and aftershave she was accustomed to. Lucy began moving with a smooth, ground-covering walk that was surprisingly comfortable. Clara had expected the bareback ride to be jarring and difficult, but the mare's gait was so steady that she quickly relaxed into the rhythm. They climbed steadily through the deepening snow, following what appeared to be a well-worn trail. Jake guided the horse with subtle shifts in weight and gentle touches on the lead rope, never raising his voice or making sudden movements. "How long have you lived up here?" Clara asked, partly from curiosity and partly to distract herself from their precarious situation. "About 5 years," Jake replied. "Built the cabin myself after I left the army." Clara filed away this new information about her mysterious rescuer. A former soldier would explain his calm competence in crisis situations and his obvious familiarity with living in harsh conditions. "Do you have family in the area?" Jake was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he had heard her question. When he finally answered, his voice carried the same weight she had noticed before. "Had a brother. He's the one I told you about, the one the mountains took." Clara felt a pang of sympathy for this taciturn man who had clearly experienced significant loss. "I'm sorry. Happened 3 winters ago," Jake continued, seemingly willing to share more of his story now that they were away from the road. "Tommy was always reckless, thought he knew these mountains better than he did. Got caught in a storm like this. 1. Tried to make it back to town instead of seeking shelter." Clara understood now why Jake had been so insistent about helping her. She had been making exactly the same mistake his brother had made, underestimating the mountain's danger and overestimating her own capabilities. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being Lucy's steady hoofbeats in the snow and the whistle of wind through the pine trees. Clara found herself leaning back slightly against Jake's solid presence, grateful for his warmth and reassuring steadiness. The trail wound through dense forest, past frozen streams and over ridges that offered glimpses of the valley below. In better weather, Clara imagined the views would be spectacular, but now everything was obscured by the driving snow. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Clara saw a warm yellow light flickering through the trees ahead. As they drew closer, she could make out the outline of a small log cabin, smoke rising from its chimney into the stormy sky. "Home," Jake said simply, guiding Lucy toward a small barn that stood beside the cabin. The barn was modest but well built, with stalls for 2 horses and space for hay and equipment. Jake dismounted first, then helped Clara slide down from Lucy's back. Her legs were unsteady after the ride, and she was grateful for his supporting hand, while Jake tended to his horse. Clara looked around the barn with interest. Everything was meticulously organized and maintained. Tools hung in their designated places, feed bins were properly sealed, and the stalls were clean and well-bedded. This was clearly the work of someone who took pride in caring for his animals. "Be warm and comfortable here," Jake said, leading Lucy into her stall and providing her with hay and water. "Earned her keep today, carrying both of us through that weather." Clara watched him work, noting the gentle way he handled the mare and the obvious affection between horse and rider. In her world, horses were status symbols or recreational diversions. For Jake, Lucy was clearly a trusted partner when he finished. With the horse, Jake picked up a lantern and gestured toward the cabin. "Let's get you warmed up properly." The cabin's interior was a revelation. Clara had expected something rough and primitive, but Jake's home was comfortable and thoughtfully appointed. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and living areas around a central stone fireplace where a fire crackled cheerfully. Handmade furniture showed excellent craftsmanship, and everything was scrupulously clean and organized. "Sit by the fire," Jake instructed, adding wood to build up the flames. "I'll make some coffee." Clara settled into a chair near the hearth, finally beginning to feel truly warm for the first time since leaving the church. Jake's coat still hung around her shoulders, and she pulled it closer, inhaling its comforting scent as Jake moved around. The kitchen preparing coffee, Clara studied her surroundings more carefully. The cabin showed clear evidence of military precision in its organization, but also personal touches that spoke to Jake's character. Hand-carved wooden bowls, a chess set with pieces carved from different types of wood, shelves lined with well-read books on subjects ranging from veterinary medicine to American history. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, impressed by the craftsmanship evident in every detail. Jake nodded, pouring hot coffee into 2 heavy ceramic mugs. "Took me 2 years, working mostly in the evenings and weekends. Had to learn carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, everything." He handed her a mug, and Clara wrapped her cold hands around it gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. "What do you do for work?" she asked, then immediately worried that she was being too inquisitive about this man's private life, but Jake seemed willing to answer. "I have a small spread about 10 miles north of here. Run cattle, breed horses, do some guiding for hunters and tourists. Not much, but it pays the bills." Clara tried to imagine the life he was describing, so different from the world she knew of social obligations, business connections, and carefully maintained appearances. Jake's existence seemed to revolve around practical necessities and genuine accomplishments rather than social status. "What about you?" Jake asked, settling into a chair across from her. "Besides getting married, I mean." The question brought Clara's current situation rushing back. For a brief time, warmed by the fire and Jake's unexpected kindness, she had almost forgotten the disaster that had brought her here. "I was supposed to be Mrs. Robert Hawkins by now," she said, her voice bitter with disappointment and embarrassment. "Instead, I'm sitting in a stranger's cabin wearing a ruined wedding dress." Jake studied her face carefully, and Clara had the feeling he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. "His loss," Jake said quietly, and something in his tone made Clara look up sharply. There was no pity in his expression, no condescending sympathy. Instead, she saw a straightforward assessment from someone who dealt with the world as it actually was, rather than as it was supposed to be. "You don't know anything about me," Clara protested. Maybe he was right to leave. "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But any man who'd leave a woman to face that kind of humiliation alone isn't worth much in my book." His words carried a conviction that surprised Clara. In her social circle, Robert's behavior would be criticized as ungentlemanly and embarrassing, but there would also be whispered speculation about what Clara might have done to drive him away. Jake's unqualified condemnation of Robert's actions was refreshing. The storm continued to rage outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Clara realized that she was completely cut off from her previous life, at least until the weather cleared. For the first time since leaving the church, she allowed herself to really consider what came next. Clara woke to the sound of wood being split outside the cabin. Gray morning light filtered through the windows, and the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. She lay still for a moment, trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar surroundings. Jake had given her his bedroom the night before, insisting he would be comfortable on the couch by the fire. The bed was simple but well made, with thick quilts that had kept her warm through the cold mountain night. Her wedding dress hung on a wooden peg, finally dry but permanently stained and wrinkled beyond repair. Jake had found an old flannel shirt and a pair of work pants for her to wear, both far too large but clean and warm. Clara had protested that she couldn't possibly wear men's clothing, but practicality had won over propriety. The transformation from bride to mountain dweller felt symbolic of something larger shifting in her life. She made her way to the main room, where the fire still glowed with banked coals. Through the window, she could see Jake methodically splitting logs, his movements efficient and rhythmic. He had been up for hours, judging by the neat stack of firewood growing beside the chopping block. Clara started coffee using the instructions Jake had given her the night before, grateful for something useful to do. In her normal life, servants handled such tasks, but here she found satisfaction in this simple act of preparing something with her own hands. Jake entered a few minutes later, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door. His hair was damp with melted snow, and his cheeks were red from the cold air. "Storm's over," he announced, accepting the coffee mug she offered him. "But the roads will be impassable for at least another day. Snow's too deep, and the county won't get their plows up here until the main highways are clear." Clara absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of her was anxious to return to town and begin dealing with the aftermath of her failed wedding, but another part was reluctant to leave this peaceful refuge, where no one expected anything from her except basic human decency. "I should let my family know I'm safe," she said. "They must be worried sick." Jake nodded toward a corner of the room where an old-fashioned radio sat on a wooden shelf. "Radio's our only communication up here. Weather service broadcasts twice a day, and sometimes you can reach the sheriff's office in town if atmospheric conditions are right." He tuned the radio to the emergency frequency and managed to raise the dispatcher in Silverbrook. Clara was able to send a brief message through the operator, confirming that she was safe and would return when the roads were passable. She could hear the relief in the dispatcher's voice as he promised to relay the message to her family immediately. "That's settled then," Jake said, switching off the radio. "Guess you're stuck with me for another day or two." Clara detected a hint of something in his tone, not displeasure exactly, but perhaps uncertainty about how to handle an unexpected houseguest from such a different background. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quickly. "If there's anything I can do to help ... Jake studied her thoughtfully. "You ever done any real work? Physical labor, I mean?" The question might have been insulting coming from someone else, but Clara sensed genuine curiosity rather than condescension. "Not really," she admitted. "I've organized charity events, managed household staff, things like that, but nothing that required actual manual labor." "Well, there's plenty to do around here if you're interested in learning," Jake said. "Animals need tending, cabin needs maintenance, firewood needs stacking. Mountain life doesn't leave much room for idle hands." Clara found herself intrigued by the prospect. Her entire life had been structured around social obligations and appearances. The idea of work that produced tangible, useful results was unexpectedly appealing. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Jake's first lesson involved caring for Lucy and the other horse in his barn. A spirited gelding named Thunder, who served as backup when Lucy needed rest. Clara had never been inside a working barn before, and she was fascinated by the intricate routine of feeding, watering, and grooming the animals. "Horses are honest," Jake explained as he showed her how to brush Lucy's coat properly. "They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not. They respond to how you treat them, nothing more or less." Clara found the repetitive motion of brushing soothing, and Lucy seemed to enjoy the attention. The mare stood patiently while Clara worked, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle Clara's shoulder affectionately. "She likes you," Jake observed. The same thing he had said during their desperate ride through the storm. "I like her too," Clara realized. "I never understood the appeal of horses before. In town, they're just transportation or status symbols. But Lucy feels like a partner." "That's exactly what she is," Jake agreed. "Up here, your horse can mean the difference between life and death. You develop a different kind of relationship when survival depends on trust." They moved on to other chores, splitting, kindling, organizing the tool shed, checking the cabin's weather, stripping for gaps that might let in cold air. Each task required Clara to learn new skills, and she was surprised by how quickly her Hands adapted to unfamiliar tools. By midday, Clara's muscles ached in ways they never had before, but she felt a deep satisfaction she had never experienced from any of her previous activities. The work was purposeful and immediate. When she split wood correctly, the pieces fell cleanly apart. When she failed to grip the axe properly, nothing happened. "You're getting the hang of it," Jake said, watching her successfully split a particularly stubborn log. "Most city folks give up after 10 minutes. "I'm not most city folks, apparently," Clara replied, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cold air. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, revealing the man he might have been before. Whatever tragedies had made him so guarded, they broke for lunch. Simple fare of bread, cheese, and preserved meat that Jake had prepared himself. Clara was amazed by how delicious everything tasted after the morning's physical exertion. "Tell me about your brother," she said as they ate, curious about the loss that had shaped Jake's current isolation. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Clara worried she had overstepped. But eventually, he began to speak. "Tommy was 2 years younger than me, but he always acted like he was older. Fearless to the point of stupidity sometimes. When we were kids, he'd climb the highest trees, swim in the deepest rivers, take on boys twice his size in fights." Jake's voice carried the fondness of someone remembering a beloved sibling despite the pain of loss. "We served together in Afghanistan," he continued. "I thought the army might teach him some caution, but it just gave him more dangerous things to be reckless about. Somehow he made it through 2 tours without a scratch." Clara waited patiently as Jake gathered his thoughts, sensing this was a story he rarely told. "When we came back, Tommy couldn't settle down. Civilian life felt too tame after everything we'd been through. He got a job with a search and rescue outfit, figuring saving lives would give him the adrenaline rush he needed." "That sounds noble," Clara said softly. "It was mostly. Tommy saved dozens of people over the years, lost hikers, stranded climbers, folks who got caught in bad weather. He was fearless when other people's lives were on the line." Jake stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. But that same fearlessness made him careless about his own safety. 3 years ago, he got a call about some tourists trapped by an avalanche. Rescue teams were waiting for conditions to improve, but Tommy couldn't stand the thought of people suffering while he sat around doing nothing. Clara felt her heart sink, sensing where the story was heading. He went up alone, against direct orders, found the tourists and got them to safety, but by then another storm had moved in. Tommy tried to make it back down the mountain instead of waiting it out in the shelter cabin. Jake's voice became very quiet, and Clara had to strain to hear him. They found him 3 days later, not half a mile from safety. If he had just stayed put, waited for the weather to clear, he'd still be alive. The silence stretched between them, heavy with Jake's grief and guilt. Clara understood now why he had been so insistent about helping her, why he lived alone in these mountains that had taken his brother. "You blame yourself," she said, not making it a question. "I should have been there," Jake replied. "Should have gone with him, or stopped him from going at all. Tommy always listened to me, eventually. But I was down in Denver that week, dealing with some business." Clara rose and moved to stand beside him at the window. "You can't live someone else's life for them," she said gently. "Even someone you love." Jake turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression. "Is that what you were doing? Living someone else's life?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She had been so focused on Jake's story that she hadn't considered how it might relate to her own situation. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I thought I was living my own life, making my own choices. But looking back now, I'm not sure how. Many of those choices were really mine." They spent the afternoon working together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself thinking about the life she had been building with Robert, the grand house they would have shared, The social obligations that would have filled her days, the children who would have been raised by nannies while she attended committee meetings and charity luncheons. Had any of it been what she actually wanted, or had she simply been following the path laid out for her by family expectations and social convention? As evening approached, Jake prepared dinner while Clara set the table with his simple but sturdy dishes. The domestic routine felt natural despite their brief acquaintance, as if they had been sharing meals for years rather than days. "What will you do when you go back?" Jake asked as they ate by LAMPLIGHT. Clara had been dreading this question because she had no answer. "I honestly don't know. The wedding preparations consumed so much of my time and energy that I never thought about what came after, or what would happen if there was no after." "You could start over," Jake suggested. "Somewhere new, where nobody knows your history." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Clara had never lived anywhere but Silverbrook, never been away from family and familiar surroundings for more than a few weeks at a time. "With what money, what skills?" she asked. "I'm trained for exactly one thing, being a wealthy man's wife. Everything I know how to do requires servants and social connections and a certain level of society." "You learned to split wood today," Jake pointed out. "Fed horses, organized tools, made coffee. Seems like you're more adaptable than you think." Clara considered this, remembering the satisfaction she had felt from the day's simple accomplishments. "Those aren't exactly marketable skills for a woman." "Depends on the market," Jake said with a slight smile. "Mountains don't care much about gender when it comes to survival." After dinner, they sat by the fire, Jake reading while Clara mended a tear in one of his shirts. She had learned basic sewing as part of her education, though she had never expected to use the skill for anything more practical than decorative embroidery. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said, setting down her needle. Jake looked up from his book, a volume of poetry that surprised her given his practical nature. "Why haven't you married? Built a family up here?" Jake closed the book and stared into the fire for a long moment. "Tried once," he said finally. "Girl named Sarah from down in Cheyenne. Met her while I was still figuring out what to do with myself after the army." Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She came up here once, saw how I was living, and made it clear that marriage would mean me moving back to civilization. She couldn't understand why anyone would choose this life when they could have comfort and convenience in town." "And you couldn't understand why anyone would choose town when they could have this," Clara said, beginning to grasp the fundamental difference in values. "Exactly. We wanted different things from life, and neither of us was willing to compromise." She married a banker 6 months later. Clara thought about Robert, who had grown increasingly distant as their wedding approached. Had he been struggling with similar doubts about the life they were planning together? "Do you regret it? Not compromising, I mean?" Jake shook his head decisively. "I've seen what happens when people try to live someone else's version of happiness. Tommy did it for a while, tried to settle down with a nice girl, work a regular job, be what everyone expected him to be. Nearly drove him crazy. But don't you get lonely?" The question seemed to surprise Jake, as if he had never really considered it before. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I'd rather be alone and honest than surrounded by people and pretending to be someone I'm not." Clara understood the sentiment, though she had never been alone long enough to know which she preferred. Her entire life had been spent surrounded by family, friends, servants, and social obligations. The idea of solitude was both frightening and intriguing. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the cabin's eaves. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Clara felt more at peace than she had in months. "What if I stayed?" she said suddenly, the words escaping before she had fully formed the thought. Jake looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "What if I didn't go back to Silverbrook? What if I learned to live like this, learned to be useful instead of ornamental?" The silence that followed was charged with possibility and danger. Clara could see Jake considering her words, weighing them against his knowledge of the harsh realities of mountain life. "You don't know what you're saying," he said finally. "This isn't some romantic adventure. Winters up here can kill you if you make a mistake. There's no servants, no safety net, no going back to town when things get difficult." "I know that," Clara said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "But maybe that's exactly what I need. A life where survival depends on my own competence instead of my family's money." Jake studied her face in the firelight, looking for signs of the pampered society girl who had stumbled into his world wearing a wedding dress. But Clara felt as if that girl had been left behind on the mountain road, transformed by cold and abandonment and unexpected kindness into someone entirely new. The sound of approaching horses woke Clara before dawn. She lay still in Jake's bed, listening to the steady rhythm of hoofbeats growing closer through the crisp morning air. Voices carried across the snow, her father's familiar baritone and another man she didn't recognize. Jake was already moving in the main room, his boots quick across the wooden floor. Clara heard him open the door and step outside, his voice low and respectful as he greeted the riders. "Mr. Thompson, Sheriff Martinez. Coffee's hot if you're interested." Clara's heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Martinez's name. Her father had brought official escort, which meant he was taking no chances of her attempting another escape. She dressed quickly in Jake's borrowed clothes, knowing this might be the last time she wore them. When she emerged from the bedroom, 3 men stood around Jake's table, steam rising from their coffee mugs. Her father looked older than she remembered, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. Sheriff Martinez was a compact man with kind eyes who had known Clara since childhood. "Clara, honey," her father said, rising immediately. "Thank God you're safe." James Thompson's relief was genuine, but Clara could see the questions forming behind his eyes. He took in her borrowed clothes, her windburnt face, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders instead of pinned up in its usual style. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, accepting his careful embrace. "Jake saved my life. If he hadn't found me on that road, ... She let the sentence hang, knowing her father would understand the implications. James Thompson had lived in Wyoming long enough to respect the mountain's ability to kill the unprepared. "We're grateful," her father said, turning to shake Jake's hand formally. "More grateful than we can express." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his manner gentle but official. "Clara, I need to ask, did you leave that church of your own free will? Nobody forced you to go?" "Of course I left on my own," Clara replied, though she understood why the question was necessary. A young woman disappearing from her own wedding and turning up 2 days later in the company of a stranger would naturally raise concerns, and Mr. Morrison here has been a perfect gentleman. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. But Jake seemed untroubled by the inquiry. This was probably standard procedure in situations like this. "Absolutely. Jake has been nothing but kind and respectful. He gave me his bed and slept on the couch. He saved my life, Sheriff." Martinez nodded, making notes in a small leather book. "Just following protocol, you understand. Your mother's been beside herself with worry." The mention of her mother brought a fresh wave of guilt. Clara could imagine Victoria Thompson's anguish, oscillating between relief that her daughter was safe and mortification at the scandal that would inevitably follow. "How bad is it in town?" Clara asked, dreading the answer. Her father and the sheriff exchanged glances. "Word's gotten around," James said carefully. "But folks are more concerned about your welfare than anything else. Robert's family left town yesterday, went back to Denver." Clara absorbed this news without surprise. The Hawkins family would want to distance themselves from the embarrassment as quickly as possible. Robert's cowardly departure would be forgotten while Clara's dramatic flight into a blizzard would be remembered and discussed for years. "We should start back," Sheriff Martinez said, glancing at the sky. The weather's clear now, but that could change quickly this time of year. Clara felt panic rising in her chest. She wasn't ready to leave this sanctuary, wasn't ready to face the whispers and pitying looks that awaited her in Silverbrook. The idea of returning to her old life felt like stepping backward into a cage. I need a few minutes to gather my things, she said, desperate for time to think. Of course, honey, her father said. Take all the time you need. But Clara could see impatience in his manner, the anxiety to get her home and begin repairing whatever damage could be repaired. To him, this was simply a crisis to be managed, not a fundamental questioning of everything she had believed about her life. Jake had remained silent during the exchange, but as Clara turned toward the bedroom, he caught her eye. Something passed between them, understanding, regret, possibility left unexplored. In the privacy of the bedroom, Clara stared at her wedding dress hanging on its peg. The beautiful gown that had represented all her hopes and dreams just days ago now looked like a costume from a play she no longer wanted to perform in. She changed back into the dress slowly, each layer feeling heavier than the last. The corset that had seemed so elegant now felt restrictive, the heavy skirts cumbersome after 2 days of freedom in practical clothes. When she looked at herself in Jake's small mirror, she saw a stranger, a woman playing dress-up in someone else's life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara? Jake's voice was barely audible through the door. Can I talk to you for a minute? She opened the door to find him standing awkwardly in the hallway, clearly uncomfortable with her father and the sheriff nearby. I wanted to give you this, he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Something to remember your time here. Clara unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a carved wooden horse no bigger than her palm. Every detail was perfect, the flowing mane, the alert ears, the powerful muscles captured in miniature. It was clearly Jake's work, probably carved during the long winter evenings, when he had nothing but time and his thoughts for company. It's beautiful, she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. When did you make this? Last night. After you went to bed, Jake admitted. Couldn't sleep, thinking about what you said, about staying. Clara looked up at him sharply, aware that her father and the sheriff were probably straining to overhear their conversation. Jake, I know it's crazy, he said quickly, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear him. I know you're not really thinking clearly right now. But if you ever decide you want something different from life, something real instead of just expected. There's a place for you here. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Clara clutched the wooden horse tightly, feeling its solid weight in her palm. I can't, she said, though every fiber of her being wanted to say yes. My family, my responsibilities. I can't just disappear. Your family will survive, Jake said gently. The question is, will you? Before Clara could respond, her father's voice called from the main room. Clara, we really should be going, honey. Jake stepped back, his face carefully neutral again. Think about it, he said. The offer stands. Clara tucked the carved horse deep into her pocket and walked back to face her father and the sheriff. Jake followed, maintaining the respectful distance of a helpful stranger rather than whatever they had become to each other over the past 2 days. The ride back to town was accomplished in relative silence. Clara rode behind her father on his horse, while Sheriff Martinez led the way down the mountain trail. The snow was deep but manageable, and the clear weather made for good traveling conditions. As they descended toward the valley, Clara caught her first glimpse of Silverbrook in 3 days. The town looked smaller somehow, its neat streets and orderly buildings seeming constrained after the vast freedom of the mountains. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business, their lives continuing exactly as they had before her world had exploded. Your mother's prepared a bath and a meal, her father said as they rode through the outskirts of town. "Dr. Henderson wants to examine you. Make sure you didn't suffer any frostbite or other injuries." Clara nodded absently, noticing how people stopped their activities to stare as their small procession passed. Word of her return would spread through Silverbrook within the hour, carrying with it all sorts of speculation about where she had been and what had happened to her. The Thompson house looked exactly as she had left it, but Clara felt like she was seeing it with new eyes. The elaborate architecture that had once seemed elegant now struck her as ostentatious. The perfectly manicured grounds spoke of wealth spent on appearance rather than function. Victoria Thompson burst through the front door before they had fully dismounted, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her daughter. "Oh, Clara, my darling girl," she sobbed. "I thought we'd lost you forever. When you didn't come home that first night, and then the storm ... I was sure you were dead somewhere in the snow." Clara allowed herself to be enveloped in her mother's familiar perfume and warmth, feeling the weight of guilt for the anguish she had caused. But even as she comforted her mother, part of her mind remained on the mountain, in a simple cabin where life was measured by useful work rather than social expectations. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, hot baths, and carefully prepared meals. Dr. Henderson pronounced her remarkably healthy despite her ordeal, noting only some minor frostbite on her toes that would heal without complications. Clara submitted to all the attention with patient resignation, answering questions about her physical condition while deflecting more personal inquiries about her emotional state. She could see the worry in her parents' eyes, the fear that their daughter had been somehow damaged by her experience. "The wedding gifts will need to be returned," Victoria said as they sat together in the parlor that evening. "I've already begun making lists. Some of the more expensive items might require personal visits to explain." Clara listened to her mother's plans for damage control, understanding that this was Victoria's way of coping with an impossible situation. By focusing on practical details, she could avoid confronting the larger questions about what had gone wrong and what would happen next. "People are already talking, of course," Victoria continued. "Martha Simmons stopped by this afternoon with a casserole and so many questions I thought she might never leave. The story she's heard is that you had some kind of nervous collapse, brought on by pre-wedding anxiety." "Is that the story we're telling?" Clara asked. "It seems the most dignified explanation," Victoria replied carefully. "A young woman overwhelmed by the stress of such a large wedding, temporarily not thinking clearly. It happens more often than people realize." Clara understood the strategy. By framing her disappearance as a medical episode rather than a deliberate choice, her family could maintain some social standing while positioning her as a victim rather than a willing participant in the scandal. But the explanation sat badly with Clara, who felt more clear-headed now than she had in months. Her flight from the church hadn't been the act of an unbalanced mind. It had been the first truly honest thing she had done in years. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Clara lay awake staring at the carved wooden horse Jake had given her. In the lamplight, she could see every detail of his craftsmanship, the care he had taken to create something beautiful from a simple piece of wood. She thought about Jake alone in his cabin, tending his fire and caring for his horses. Was he thinking about her as she was thinking about him? Did he really mean what he had said about there being a place for her in his world? The rational part of Clara's mind cataloged all the reasons why such a life was impossible. She had no skills that would be useful in the wilderness, no experience with the kind of self-sufficiency that mountain living required. She would be abandoning her family, her social position, everything that defined her identity. But another part of her remembered the satisfaction of splitting wood correctly, the trust in Lucy's eyes as she groomed the mare's coat, the peace of sitting by Jake's fire without worrying about what anyone expected from her. For the first time in her life, Clara had tasted real freedom, not the carefully circumscribed liberty of a wealthy woman's choices, but the absolute freedom to define herself through her own actions rather than other people's expectations. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara?" her father's voice called quietly. "Are you awake?" She tucked the wooden horse under her pillow and opened the door to find James Thompson standing in the hallway, still dressed despite the late hour. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Clara shook her head, stepping aside to let him enter her room. He settled into the chair by her window, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if that cowboy hadn't found you," he said. "The mountains don't forgive mistakes, Clara. You could have died out there." "I know, Dad. I wasn't thinking clearly when I left the church." James Thompson studied his daughter's face in the dim light. "Weren't you? Or were you thinking more clearly than you had in a long time?" The question surprised Clara. She had expected lectures about responsibility and proper behavior, not this quiet understanding. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "Everything I thought I wanted, everything I was working toward. It all seems hollow now." Her father nodded slowly. "I was about your age when I realized I didn't want the life my parents had planned for me. They expected me to take over the family business back in Boston, marry well, live the life of a proper gentleman." Clara had never heard this story before. "What did you do?" "I came west. Used my inheritance to buy land here in Wyoming. Learned to raise cattle and horses. Your mother's family thought she was crazy to marry a cowboy, even a rich one. Do you regret it?" "Never," James said firmly. "But I had advantages you don't have. I was a man with money and social freedom to make my own choices. The world doesn't offer women the same opportunities." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James stood to leave. "Whatever you decide about your future," he said, "I want you to know that your mother and I will support you. We love you more than we love what other people think of us." After he left, Clara returned to her bed and pulled out Jake's carved horse. In the morning, she would have to begin the process of rebuilding her life in Silverbrook. She would face the whispers and the pity, endure the well-meaning advice and the not-so-subtle suggestions about suitable matches to replace Robert. But tonight, she allowed herself to dream of a different future, one where she woke each morning to meaningful work, where her worth was measured by her contributions rather than her connections, where she could be truly herself, rather than society's version of what a woman should be. The carved horse seemed to pulse with possibility in her. A tangible connection to a man who had offered her something precious, the chance to discover who she really was when stripped of everything she had been taught to value. 3 weeks after returning to Silverbrook, Clara stood in her family's parlor receiving yet another well-meaning visitor. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary, had arrived with a covered dish and barely concealed curiosity about Clara's health crisis. "You look remarkably well, dear," Mrs. Walsh said, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. "Considering the ordeal you've been through." Clara smiled politely and offered the appropriate responses, but her mind wandered to the carved wooden horse hidden in her jewelry box upstairs. Each night, she held it while planning an escape she wasn't sure she had the courage to attempt. The past 3 weeks had been a careful dance of social rehabilitation. Victoria Thompson had orchestrated a campaign to present Clara's disappearance as a temporary breakdown brought on by wedding stress, followed by a miraculous recovery thanks to family support and medical attention. The story was accepted with varying degrees of belief, but it allowed Clara to move through Silverbrook without complete social ostracism. Still, things had changed. Conversations stopped when Clara entered the rooms. Invitations arrived less frequently. The young men who had once competed for her attention now treated her with careful politeness that bordered on pity. "I've spoken with Reverend Mitchell," Mrs. Walsh continued. And he's assured me that the church is prepared to offer special prayers for your continued recovery." "That's very kind," Clara replied, though she wondered what kind of recovery they were praying for. A return to the compliant society daughter she had been. The erasure of whatever independence she had discovered in Jake's mountain cabin. After Mrs. Walsh departed, Clara retreated to her room and opened the letter that had arrived that morning. Her sister Madison had written from Colorado Springs, full of concern and practical advice. "Dearest Clara," the letter began, "I've been thinking about our conversation before the wedding, when you mentioned feeling uncertain about your future with Robert. Perhaps this crisis has been a blessing in disguise, forcing you to confront feelings you weren't ready to acknowledge. I have news that might interest you. My friend Catherine Brennan has opened a school for young ladies in Denver. It's quite progressive. They teach not just music and French, but also bookkeeping, typing, and other skills that allow women to support themselves. Catherine is looking for an assistant with your background and education. The salary isn't much, but it would be enough for modest independence. I know Mother and Father want you to remain in Silverbrook until this scandal dies down, but perhaps a fresh start somewhere new would serve you better. Think about it, dear sister. You have more choices than you realize." Clara read the letter 3 times, her heart racing with each reading. A job. Real work with real compensation. The chance to leave Silverbrook and its suffocating expectations behind without having to flee into the wilderness. But even as excitement built in her chest, she found herself thinking about Jake's cabin, about the satisfaction of useful work, and the peace of mountain mornings. Madison's offer represented safety and respectability, a socially acceptable form of independence that would allow her to maintain some connection to her family and former life. Jake's offer represented something far more radical and uncertain. That afternoon, Clara walked through downtown Silverbrook, ostensibly shopping, but really observing the life she would be abandoning if she chose either of her alternatives. Familiar streets held memories of childhood and adolescence, but they also felt constraining now. Like clothes she had outgrown, she passed the church where she should have been married, its Gothic spires reaching toward gray winter clouds. Sight no longer brought the sharp pain it had in the first days after her return. Robert's abandonment had become almost abstract, a catalyst for changes she might never have considered otherwise. At Morrison's General Store, Clara stopped to purchase supplies her mother had requested. The proprietor, William Morrison, greeted her with the careful courtesy she had grown accustomed to. "Miss Thompson," he said formally, "I hope you're feeling better." "Much better, thank you," Clara replied, wondering if William Morrison was any relation to Jake. The name was common enough, but something in the man's weathered features reminded her of the cowboy who had saved her life. As if reading her thoughts. William Morrison glanced around the store to ensure they were alone, then leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "I heard from my nephew Jake that you spent some time up at his cabin during that storm," he said quietly. "Wanted to thank you for the kind words you sent through Sheriff Martinez about how well he treated you." Clara's heart jumped. "Jake is your nephew?" "My brother's boy. Good man, though he's chosen a hard life up in those mountains. Some folks in town have been saying things that aren't charitable about a young lady staying with a bachelor, even in an emergency." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding the implications. "Jake was a perfect gentleman. He saved my life." "I know that, and anyone with sense knows it too," William Morrison said firmly. "But you know how people talk. Just wanted you to hear that Jake's got family in town who think well of him and of you for recognizing his character." The conversation haunted Clara as she completed her errands and walked home. She hadn't considered how the scandal might affect Jake, who had done nothing but show her kindness when she desperately needed it. Her presence in his cabin for 2 days would be fodder for gossip that could damage his reputation and his business. Evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Clara made her decision. "I've received a letter from Madison," she announced. pulling the correspondence from her pocket. "She's found me a position in Denver if I'm interested." Victoria Thompson's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "A position? Clara, dear, you don't need to work. We have plenty of money to support you until you're ready to marry again." "Perhaps I don't want to marry again," Clara said quietly. "Perhaps I want to support myself." The silence that followed was deafening. James Thompson set down his wineglass and studied his daughter's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for evaluating livestock. "What kind of position?" he asked finally. Clara explained Madison's offer, watching her parents' faces for their reaction. Victoria looked horrified at the prospect of her daughter working for wages, while James appeared thoughtful. "It's a respectable occupation," Clara continued. "Teaching young ladies from good families. I would be using my education for something meaningful instead of just existing until someone decides to marry me." "But Denver is so far away," Victoria protested. "And living on your own, without family protection." "Clara, you're not thinking clearly again." The accusation stung because Clara felt more clear-headed than she had in years. "I'm thinking perfectly clearly, Mother. For the first time in my life, I'm considering what I actually want instead of what's expected of me." James Thompson cleared his throat diplomatically. "It's not an unreasonable idea," he said, earning a sharp look from his wife. "Many well-bred women are entering professions these days. Teaching is certainly appropriate. Appropriate for women who have no other options," Victoria snapped. "Clara has options. She's beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. There will be other suitors once this unfortunate episode is forgotten." "Will there?" Clara asked. "Will there really? Or will I always be the woman who ran away from her own wedding, who spent 2 days alone with a strange man? Do you honestly believe any respectable man will want to marry me now?" The brutal honesty of her words silenced her mother's protests. They all knew Clara was right. Her marriage prospects in Silverbrook had been severely damaged, perhaps irreparably. "Denver might be exactly what you need," James said thoughtfully. "A fresh start, somewhere your past doesn't define your future." Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward her father, who seemed to understand her need for independence, even if he didn't fully approve of it. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "But I wanted you both to know that I'm considering it seriously." Later that night, Clara sat by her bedroom window writing 2 letters. The first was to Madison, expressing interest in the Denver position and asking for more details about the work and living arrangements. The second letter was more difficult to write. She had started it dozens of times over the past 3 weeks, never finding the right words to express what Jake's kindness had meant to her. Tonight she forced herself to complete it. "Dear Jake," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well and that the winter has been kind to you and Lucy. I think of you both often, and of the 2 days that changed my understanding of what life could be. I wanted you to know that your offer has been in my thoughts constantly since returning to town. While I cannot accept it, the practical realities make it impossible. I am deeply grateful that you made it. Knowing that such a life exists, that there are people like you living honestly and freely, has given me courage to seek my own path. I may be leaving Silverbrook soon to take a teaching position in Denver. It's not the radical change you offered, but it represents independence of a sort. I hope you understand that while I cannot choose your world, I cannot return to the one I left behind either. Please know that you saved more than my life that night on the mountain road. You showed me that there are alternatives to the life I thought was inevitable. I will carry that gift with me wherever I go. The carved horse you gave me sits on my dressing table, a daily reminder of your kindness and the brief taste of freedom I experienced in your cabin. I will treasure it always, with sincere gratitude and warmest regards. Clara." She sealed the letter and set it aside to be mailed the next day, feeling both relief and regret at this formal farewell to the man who had offered her everything she thought she wanted, but couldn't bring herself to accept. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Henderson arrived early, requesting a private consultation with Clara. She met him in her father's study, curious about the urgency of his visit. "Miss Thompson," he began formally, "I wanted to discuss your recent ordeal with you privately, away from your parents' well-meaning concern." Clara braced herself for another lecture about the delicate nature of female constitution and the importance of avoiding future episodes of nervous strain. Instead, Dr. Henderson surprised her. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, he said, "and I've seen many young women suffer what your mother chooses to call nervous breakdowns. In my experience, these episodes are often the mind's way of rejecting circumstances that the conscious will cannot bring itself to oppose." Clara stared at him, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "What I'm saying, in plain terms, is that I don't believe you suffered any kind of medical crisis. I believe you made a rational decision to escape a situation that had become intolerable, and you had the courage to act on that decision, even when it meant facing significant danger." "Dr. Henderson, he raised a hand to stop her protest. "I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything, but I want you to know that if you decide to leave Silverbrook, whether for Denver or anywhere else, you have my complete support. I've already spoken with your father about providing you with medical references, should you need them for employment purposes." The doctor's unexpected alliance brought tears to Clara's eyes. She had felt so isolated in her struggle to define her own future, not realizing that others in her community understood her situation better than she had imagined. "There's something else," Dr. Henderson continued. "I've heard rumors about your time with Jake Morrison, and I want you to know that I've made it clear to anyone who will listen that the man almost certainly saved your life. I've treated enough frostbite cases to know that another hour in that storm would have been fatal." "Thank you," Clara whispered, touched by his defense of both her reputation and Jake's character. After Dr. Henderson left, Clara walked to the post office and mailed her letters. The one to Madison felt like stepping onto a bridge toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The letter to Jake felt like closing a door on possibilities too dangerous to pursue, but too precious to forget. That afternoon, she received an unexpected reply to a letter she hadn't known was sent. Her father appeared in the parlor holding a telegram, his expression unreadable. "This came for you," he said, handing her the yellow paper. Clara's hands trembled as she read the message. "Teaching position available immediately. Stop salary $40 per month, plus room and board. Stop wire response if interested. Stop CB Orion and $40 per month." Clara had never thought about money in such concrete terms, but she understood instinctively that this represented true independence, the ability to house, feed, and clothe herself through her own labor. "Madison works quickly," James observed, reading over her shoulder. "She always has," Clara replied, still staring at the telegram that represented everything she had been afraid to hope for. "Well," her father asked gently, "what are you going to tell them?" Clara looked around the familiar parlor, with its expensive furniture and carefully arranged flowers, its silk wallpaper and crystal chandelier. Everything in this room represented security, comfort, and social position. Everything she had been raised to value and protect. But she thought of Jake's simple cabin, where every object served a purpose and beauty came from function rather than display. She thought of the satisfaction of splitting wood properly, of Lucy's trusting response to gentle handling, of the peace that came from living honestly rather than for appearances. She couldn't have Jake's life, but perhaps she could have something like his integrity. "I'm going to accept," she said, the words coming out stronger and more certain than she had expected. "I'm going to Denver." The Denver train station bustled with travelers, vendors, and porters shouting directions in 3 languages. Clara stood on the platform clutching her single carpet bag, overwhelmed by the noise and chaos of a city larger than anything she had ever experienced. Silverbrook could have fit into one corner of Denver's sprawling industrial landscape. Catherine Brennan emerged from the crowd like a ship cutting through choppy waters. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with graying brown hair pinned severely. Back and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable, cut for movement rather than display. "Miss Thompson?" she called, approaching with confident strides. "I'm Catherine Brennan. Welcome to Denver." Clara shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that spoke of physical work rather than leisure. This was clearly a woman who had carved out her own place in the world through determination and competence. "Thank you for meeting me, Miss Brennan. I'm grateful for this opportunity. Call me Catherine, please. We'll be working closely together." And formal titles create unnecessary distance. Catherine gestured toward the station exit. "Shall we collect your luggage?" "This is all I brought," Clara said, indicating her modest bag. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly, but she made no comment. "About the sparse belongings. Traveling light is practical. We can arrange for anything else you need once you're settled." They walked through Denver's busy streets, Catherine pointing out landmarks and explaining the city's layout. Clara tried to absorb everything while processing the dramatic change in her circumstances. 3 months ago, she had been preparing for a life of comfortable dependence as Robert Hawkins' wife. Now she was walking through an unfamiliar city, about to begin earning her own living among strangers. The Brennan Academy for Young Ladies occupied a 3-story brick building in a respectable residential neighborhood. The structure had clearly been a private mansion before being converted to educational use, with large windows and spacious rooms well suited to classrooms. "We serve daughters of merchants, professionals, and skilled tradesmen," Catherine explained as they climbed the front steps. "Families with enough money to educate their girls, but not enough social standing for the elite finishing schools. Our students need practical skills along with traditional accomplishments." Clara nodded, understanding the academy's position in Denver's social hierarchy. It was a middle ground between charity schools and exclusive institutions serving families. Much like her own before her father's success in ranching had elevated their status, the interior buzzed with activity despite the late afternoon hour. Young women moved between classrooms carrying books. Typewriters clattered from an open doorway, and Clara could hear piano scales being practiced somewhere upstairs. "Evening classes," Catherine explained, noting Clara's surprise. "Many of our students work during the day and attend school in the evenings. We adapt our schedule to their needs rather than forcing them to adapt to ours." Clara was introduced to the other faculty members during a brief tour. Miss Helen Porter taught mathematics and bookkeeping with the precision of a former bank clerk. Mrs. Ruth Stevens handled languages and literature, her cultured accent revealing an Eastern education. Mr. George Hawthorne, the only male instructor, taught typing and business correspondence with the efficiency of someone who understood the modern commercial world. Miss Thompson will be assisting with general instruction and helping to develop our new Department of Domestic Arts, Catherine announced. Her background makes her particularly suited to teaching young ladies the skills they'll need to manage households efficiently, whether as wives or as independent women. Clara felt a moment of panic at the word independent. She was still learning what that meant for herself, let alone qualified to teach others about it. Her room was on the 3rd floor, a small but comfortable space with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe that seemed enormous compared to her limited belongings. A window overlooked the school's small garden, where a few hardy plants struggled against the high altitude and unpredictable weather. That evening, Catherine invited Clara to share dinner in her private apartment above the school. The meal was simple but well prepared, served in a sitting room lined with books and decorated with what Clara recognized as student artwork. "Tell me about yourself," Catherine said as they ate. "Your sister's letter mentioned some recent difficulties, but I prefer to hear people's stories in their own words." Clara chose her words carefully, explaining her broken engagement and the crisis that had led her to seek independence. She found herself describing Jake's cabin and the 2 days that had shown her a different way of living, though she didn't mention his offer or the depth of feeling that had developed between them. Interesting, Catherine mused when Clara finished. Most women discover their need for independence gradually, through accumulated disappointments and frustrations. Your awakening was rather dramatic. Perhaps too dramatic, Clara admitted. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making a terrible mistake, abandoning everything familiar for something I don't really understand. Catherine smiled, the expression transforming. Her serious face. I felt the same way 20 years ago when I left Boston to establish this school. My family was horrified that I would choose work over marriage, independence over security. Do you regret it? Never, though I won't pretend. It's been easy. Independence requires constant vigilance and occasional compromise. But the alternative, living your life according to other people's expectations, is a kind of death, don't you think? Clara nodded, remembering the suffocating weeks in Silverbrook after her return from the mountains. How do you manage? Loneliness. Who says I'm lonely? Catherine laughed. I'm surrounded by interesting people doing meaningful work. I have friendships based on mutual respect rather than social convenience. I've never married, but I've never lacked for companionship. The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from teaching methods to women's suffrage to the practical challenges of running a business in a male-dominated world. Clara went to bed feeling more hopeful about her decision than she had since leaving Silverbrok. Her first week at the academy passed in a blur of lesson planning, classroom observation, and adjustment to city life. Clara discovered that teaching required skills she had never developed: the ability to command attention, explain complex concepts simply, and maintain order among energetic young women who had little patience for irrelevant instruction. Her domestic arts classes proved more challenging than expected. Clara had assumed that her upbringing had prepared her to teach household management, but she quickly realized that her knowledge was limited to directing servants rather than performing tasks herself. When a student asked for instruction in bread baking, Clara had to admit she had never made bread without assistance. "We'll learn together," she told the class, earning surprised but appreciative smiles. "I'll practice the techniques and teach them to you as I master them myself." This honesty created an unexpected bond with her students, who responded better to a teacher willing to admit ignorance than one who pretended to knowledge she didn't possess. Clara found herself studying domestic skills with the same intensity she had once applied to literature and music. In her free time, Clara explored Denver with the curiosity of someone discovering an entirely new world. The city's energy fascinated her, the constant construction, the mix of cultures and languages, the sense that fortunes could be made or lost based on individual effort rather than inherited position. She visited museums and theaters, walked through markets filled with goods from around the world, and observed the daily lives of working women who supported themselves through labor rather than marriage. These women seemed to possess a confidence that Clara envied and hoped to develop. 2 weeks into her tenure at the academy, Clara received her first letter from home. Victoria Thompson's carefully controlled handwriting filled 3 pages with news of Silverbrook and barely concealed disapproval of Clara's choices. The Ladies' Auxiliary has voted to name the new library wing in honor of Mrs. Hawkins, her mother wrote. I couldn't help but think that if circumstances had been different, it might have been named for you instead. Mrs. Simmons asked after you yesterday, and I had to explain that you're working in Denver. She seemed quite shocked that any daughter of mine would need to earn her own living. Clara read between the lines, understanding that her mother was struggling with the social implications of having a working daughter. In Silverbrook's rigid hierarchy, ladies managed charity work and social events, but never received wages for their efforts. Your father speaks proudly of your independence, The letter continued, "But I confess I don't understand why you chose such a difficult path when easier alternatives were available. Robert's departure was unfortunate, but there are other suitable men who might have overlooked the circumstances of your broken engagement." The suggestion that Clara should have waited for some man to overlook her supposed shame brought a flash of anger. She was building a life based on her own capabilities, contributing something meaningful to the world, and her mother saw it only as a regrettable necessity brought on by damaged marriage prospects. The letter concluded with news that made Clara's heart race. "I thought you should know that the cowboy who helped you during the storm has been asking about your welfare. William Morrison mentioned that his nephew Jake has inquired several times about whether you arrived safely in Denver. It seems the man has genuine concern for your well-being, though I can't imagine why he would expect to hear from you directly." Clara read this paragraph repeatedly, trying to understand its implications. Jake was thinking about her, asking about her situation. Did this mean he had received her farewell letter? Was he hoping for more correspondence or simply ensuring that she had found safety? That evening, Clara sat at her small desk attempting to compose a response to her mother's letter. She wanted to explain why her current life felt more authentic and meaningful than anything she had experienced in Silverbrook, but the words seemed inadequate to bridge the gap between their worldviews. Instead, she found herself writing a different letter entirely. "Dear Jake," she began, "I hope this letter finds you well as winter settles over the mountains. I am writing from Denver, where I have accepted a position teaching at a school for young ladies. The work is challenging but rewarding, and I am learning to support myself through my own efforts. My mother mentioned that you have inquired about my welfare, and I wanted to assure you that I am safe and reasonably content in my new circumstances. Denver is a fascinating city, full of people from many backgrounds working to build their futures rather than simply inheriting them. I often think of our conversations about honest work and authentic living. While my path has been different from what you offered, your example of choosing integrity over convention gave me courage to seek my own form of independence." Clara paused, uncertain how much of her feelings to reveal. The professional distance she had tried to maintain in her farewell letter felt artificial now, a barrier that served no useful purpose. "I would be grateful to hear how you and Lucy are faring as winter approaches," she continued. "Please know that your kindness during my darkest hour continues to inspire me as I navigate this new chapter of my life." She signed the letter simply Clara, and sealed it before she could reconsider the wisdom of renewing contact with the man whose offer she had been afraid to accept. The next morning brought unexpected excitement at the academy. One of the evening students, a young woman named Sarah Collins who worked as a telegraph operator during the day, burst into the faculty meeting with dramatic news. "There's been a mining accident up in the mountains," she announced breathlessly. "Cave-in at the Silver Creek mine near Silverbrook. They're calling for anyone with medical experience to help with the rescue efforts." Clara felt her blood freeze at the mention of Silverbrook. Silver Creek was only 15 miles from town, in the same mountain range where Jake lived. The mining operation employed dozens of men from the surrounding area, including many she had known since childhood. "How bad is it?" Catherine asked, her face grave with concern. "At least 20 men trapped underground," Sarah replied. "The telegraph lines have been busy all morning with calls for doctors, nurses, anyone who can help. They're setting up field hospital in town." Clara made her decision without conscious thought. "I have to go," she said, rising from her chair. "Those are my people. I can't sit safely in Denver while they're suffering." Catherine studied her face carefully. "You're not a trained nurse, Clara. What help could you realistically provide?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I have to try. I'll take the afternoon train to Silverbrook and see what I can do." "Then you won't go alone," Catherine said firmly. "The Academy has a responsibility to support emergency relief efforts. I'll come with you and we'll bring medical supplies." From our first aid stores. Within 2 hours, Clara found herself on a train heading back toward the mountains she had thought she was leaving behind forever. As Denver's sprawling buildings gave way to open rangeland and then forested slopes, she wondered if fate was drawing her back to the world she had tried to escape. More troubling was the growing certainty that Jake Morrison, with his rescue experience and knowledge of the mountain terrain, would almost certainly be involved in the mining accident response. After weeks of careful emotional distance, she was about to see him again under circumstances that would test everything she thought she had learned about herself and her choices. The train climbed steadily toward Silverbrook, carrying Clara back into the past she had been trying to transform into a foundation for her future. The train's whistle echoed through the mountain valleys as it approached Silverbrook Station. Clara pressed her face to the window, watching familiar landmarks emerge from the shadows. The town looked smaller than she remembered, but there was something different about the atmosphere, an urgency that penetrated even the train car's quiet. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and as they drew closer, Clara could see unusual activity. Wagons loaded with supplies, groups of men moving with purpose, and the organized chaos that always accompanied disaster relief efforts. "Quite a mobilization," Catherine observed, gathering her medical bag. "Your mountain community certainly know how to respond to crisis." The platform bustled with activity as they disembarked. Clara spotted Dr. Henderson supervising the unloading of medical supplies, his usually calm demeanor replaced by brisk efficiency. "Clara?" Sheriff Martinez approached, his face grim with exhaustion. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I heard about the accident," Clara replied. "We brought medical supplies from Denver. How bad is it?" 23 men trapped when the main shaft collapsed yesterday morning. We've been hearing tapping signals, so at least some are alive. But time's running out. They were directed to the makeshift field hospital in the town's meeting hall. Tables covered with white sheets served as examination areas, and volunteers bustled between stations. Clara recognized many women from church, their usual finery replaced by practical work clothes and determined expressions. Before Clara could settle into helping, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, she could see riders approaching at speed, their horses lathered with sweat. Even from a distance, Clara recognized the lead rider's easy grace in the saddle. Jake Morrison. Her heart began racing as she watched him dismount and speak urgently with Sheriff Martinez. Even dusty and exhausted from hard riding, he possessed the quiet authority that had impressed her during their time in his cabin. An hour later, Jake entered the hall with Dr. Henderson and several other men. They spread a hand-drawn map across one of the tables, speaking in low, urgent tones. "The main shaft is completely blocked," Jake was saying as Clara approached with supplies. "But there's an old ventilation tunnel that might still be accessible. It connects to the main workings below the collapse point." Clara found herself stepping closer, drawn by a growing sense of dread. She knew Jake well enough to recognize the look in his eyes, the same expression he had worn when talking about his brother's final, fatal rescue attempt. "We need volunteers," the mine owner said. "Men small enough to fit through the tunnel, experienced enough to navigate underground hazards." "I'll go," Jake said quietly, and Clara's blood turned to ice. "Jake, no," she said before she could stop herself. Every head turned toward her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, isn't there another way?" Jake's eyes met hers across the table. "Clara, I didn't know you were here." "I came from Denver when I heard about the accident," she managed, acutely aware that everyone was listening. Jake's gaze lingered on her face before he turned back to the map. "I want to be clear about the risks. This isn't a rescue mission with reasonable chances of success. This is a desperate attempt with a high probability of creating more casualties." "What about your previous experience?" Dr. Henderson asked. "My brother did search and rescue," Jake corrected, his voice tight with old pain. And he's dead because he took risks just like this one. The stark honesty created uncomfortable silence. Clara could see other men weighing their commitment against Jake's blunt assessment. But you'll still go? The mine owner asked. Jake nodded slowly. Those men have families depending on them. If there's any chance of getting them out alive, we have to try. Clara felt tears threatening and stepped away from the table. The thought of Jake disappearing into an unstable mountain, possibly never to emerge, filled her with terror. Catherine appeared beside her. That man who volunteered, he's the one who saved you during the blizzard, isn't he? He's going to get himself killed, Clara said, her voice breaking. Just like his brother did. He knows it's almost certainly a suicide mission, but he's going anyway. And you care about him more than you've admitted to yourself, Catherine observed gently. Clara looked up sharply, but the words died in her throat. Of course she cared about Jake Morrison, more than cared. The weeks in Denver had been spent missing him more than she had thought possible. It doesn't matter how I feel, Clara said finally. I made my choice when I went to Denver. Choices can be reconsidered, Catherine said quietly. Especially when circumstances change dramatically. Jake approached their station, exhaustion evident in his face. Miss Brennan, he said, acknowledging Catherine before turning to Clara. Could I speak with you privately? Clara's heart hammered as she followed him outside the hall. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades that reminded her of their evening by his cabin's fireplace. I got your letter, Jake said, without preamble. I was glad to hear you were doing well in Denver. There was no going back, Clara said honestly. Too much had changed. I had changed. Jake nodded, scanning her face as if memorizing her features. You look different. Stronger, more confident. I feel different. Teaching has given me purpose. I'm supporting myself, contributing something meaningful. I'm glad, Jake said, and she could tell he meant it. You deserved better than what Silverbrook was offering you. They stood in awkward silence, both aware of the unfinished conversation that had been interrupted by Clara's departure months ago. Finally, Clara found the courage to voice her fear. Don't go into that tunnel, she said quietly. Please, you said yourself it's probably a suicide mission. Jake's expression softened. I have to try, Clara. Those men have wives and children counting on someone to bring them home. And what about the people counting on you? What about Lucy? What about? She stopped herself before saying, what about me? But Jake seemed to hear the unspoken words. There's no one counting on me the way those families are counting on their men, Jake said gently. I live alone by choice. If something happens to me, it doesn't leave children without fathers. It leaves me without. Clara began, then stopped, horrified by what she had almost revealed. Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Without what, Clara? The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Clara could cross it with a few honest words, could admit that her months in Denver had been spent missing him. Without the man who showed me I could. Be more than what everyone expected, she said finally, choosing a safer truth. Jake reached out and touched her hand briefly, the contact sending warmth through her entire body. You would have figured that out eventually. You're stronger than you think, Clara Thompson. Before she could respond, Dr. Henderson approached with obvious urgency. Jake, we're ready to attempt the tunnel approach. Clara felt her heart sink as Jake immediately shifted into rescue mode. I'll be right there, Doc. He turned back to Clara one final time. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, Clara interrupted firmly. You're going to save those men and come back safely, because the alternative is unacceptable. Jake smiled at her fierce declaration. Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best to follow orders. 6 hours later, after the most agonizing wait of Clara's life, Jake emerged from the tunnel covered in rock dust but alive. All 23 miners had been successfully evacuated. Clara ran to him without caring about propriety or dignity, and Jake caught her in his arms. "You impossible woman," he said, holding her tightly. "I told you I'd come back." "I couldn't." "Just wait and hope," Clara replied, her face buried against his shoulder. "I needed to know you were safe." Jake pulled back to look at her face. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. When you came back here tonight, when you were so afraid for my safety, was that about duty to your community? Or was it about us?" Clara looked into his gray eyes, seeing the vulnerability behind his calm exterior. "It was about us," she said quietly. "About love and partnership, and the life we could build together if we're both brave enough to try." Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I love you, Clara Thompson. I've loved you. Since that first night when you stood in my cabin, looking like you belonged there." "I love you too," Clara replied, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I thought independence meant not needing anyone, but I was wrong. Real independence means choosing who you want to love, who you want to build a life with." Jake kissed her then, gentle at first, and then with the passion of two people who had almost lost each other forever. "So what happens now?" Clara asked. "I have responsibilities in Denver, and you have your life in the mountains. Now we figure out how to build something together that honors both our dreams," Jake replied. "Maybe part of the year in Denver, part up here. Maybe we create something entirely new that neither of us has imagined yet." Clara nodded, feeling excitement replace the fear that had dominated her thoughts. A real partnership. Not one person sacrificing their dreams for the other, but both of us working to make all our dreams possible. As dawn broke over the mountains, Clara stood beside Jake watching the town return to normal morning activities. She thought about the future they would build together, a life based on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the kind of love that enhanced rather than limited individual capabilities. Clara Thompson had begun this story as an abandoned bride walking through snow toward an uncertain future. She was ending it as a woman who had discovered that the best kind of love didn't rescue you from your life. It helped you build the life you actually wanted to live. The next 6 hours passed in agonizing suspense. Jake and 2 other volunteers entered the old ventilation tunnel just after midnight, carrying rope, lanterns, and basic medical supplies. Communication was maintained through a series of rope signals, 1 tug for continuing, 2 tugs for need assistance, 3 tugs for emergency evacuation. Clara found herself assigned to monitor the rope signals, a job that kept her directly involved in tracking Jake's progress through the dangerous underground passage. Each tug sent relief flooding through her body, confirming that he was still alive and conscious. At 3 in the morning, the rope went slack. "Signals stopped," Clara called out, trying to keep panic from her voice. Dr. Henderson and Sheriff Martinez immediately gathered around the tunnel entrance, shouting Jake's name into the darkness. No response. "How long since the last signal?" Sheriff Martinez asked. 15 minutes, Clara replied, though it felt like hours. "Could be normal," Dr. Henderson said, though his voice carried doubt. "They might have reached the trapped miners and are focusing on medical assessment." Clara stared into the black mouth of the tunnel, willing Jake to send another signal. The silence stretched unbearably, filled only by the distant sounds of other rescue efforts and the worried murmurs of volunteers. Then, just as Clara was beginning to fear the worst, the rope jerked violently, 3 sharp tugs followed by continuous pulling. "Emergency evacuation," Sheriff Martinez shouted. "Something's gone wrong." The next few minutes blurred together in a chaos of shouted orders and frantic activity. Men stationed at the tunnel entrance began hauling on the rope with desperate strength, while others prepared medical equipment for whatever injuries might emerge. The first volunteer appeared after what felt like an eternity, choking and gasping as he was pulled from the tunnel. He was conscious but clearly injured, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "Secondary collapse," he managed between coughing fits. The whole section came down just after we reached the trapped men. Jake stayed behind to help get them organized. For evacuation. Is he trapped? Dr. Henderson asked urgently. Don't know. Tunnel's partially blocked, but there might still be a way through. We got separated when the ceiling came down. Clara felt her legs give way and had to grab a nearby table for support. The scenario Jake had feared most, additional collapse. Trapping rescuers along with the original victims had come to pass. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.